Part 2 of this week's lecture will focus upon explanations for why batterers batter. As you look at the headings in this, most of this particular segment, you see that the headings are becoming and remaining a batterer. This is talks about not only those factors which may set the stage for battering to occur as an individual becomes an adult and gets involved in intimate relationships, but also what are the kinds of factors that occur that might continue to contribute to this particular behavior occurring and things. And so we look at a number of different factors and explanations in this section that are used to explain battering. Some of these factors, you'll notice, contradict each other, and such is the nature of study in any of the human services field for that matter. But again, as we talked about early in the semester, this text really is full of contradictory theories, and will sometimes cite theories and say, but there's no research that supports this, and it's one of the good things about this textbook, I think, is it really kind of takes a dispassionate view of these issues. But in any discussion regarding battering in your classroom or in the field, a lot of people are going to espouse one area or belief over another. And so here's a good array of some of the explanations for battering. First, socialization is probably one of the things that is most frequently cited as a cause of battering. This operates on the theory that violence is a learned behavior, and there is research that goes back into psychological studies in the 50s and the 60s, that if you've taken basic psychology courses, you've heard that violence is learned, and that in fact young boys learn violent behavior by observing their adult male role models more than any other group, any other population. Research has frequently shown that men exposed to parental violence and men who themselves have been abused are substantially more likely to be violent toward their spouses than are their counterparts. Childhood socialization, one of the things perhaps that it may be a situation where the batterer as a child was not taught how to solve problems, not to resolve problems. Perhaps the parent intervened whenever there was a conflict in their social relationships, instead of allowing the child to kind of work out a solution with his peers. And the peer group is the area, and this includes both sibling group as well as non-siblings. It's the relationships where probably young people learn to negotiate and solve problems in interpersonal relationships is with the peer group, where they're dealing with people that are equals to them, much more so than in their relationship with parents, where there tends to be more of a power relationship, so to speak. There's also some indication that masculine gender role stress has a part to play in this, and we'll touch on this later. I'll leave that for now. Childhood abuse can, in and of itself, can lead to antisocial orientations that are associated with chronic partner violence. This will come up also in our discussion about women as perpetrators. Both parental battering itself, abuse by parents itself, and also what's known as power assertive punishment are linked with adult interpersonal or intimate partner violence, I should say. Power assertive punishment. As we spoke of just a few moments ago, exposure to interparental violence is a very powerful predictor of future intimate partner violence, and in fact some studies suggest that it's a more powerful predictor than being the subject of abuse himself. Just observing parents involved in domestic violence. This is an area that is, that in the last 10 years or 15 years has gotten more attention in the field of child protection as well. And so, as I think I've mentioned to you earlier in the semester, whenever the police are involved in a domestic violence call, if children are present, we get a referral from the police officers and follow that up with contact with the parents to touch upon concerns about how this may have harmed the kids and whether or not there's been any emotional or mental injury, and cautioning the parents about this. Insecure attachment is another thing that connected to intimate partner violence, and in this particular statement it says insecure attachment status of fathers closely associate with the same in their children. In other words, when fathers in marital relationships have an insecure attachment with their partner, children develop the same sort of insecure attachment themselves that are likely to be carried over into their adult relationships, these attachment patterns. Childhood trauma. A link exists between exposure to trauma in childhood with adult intimate partner violence. And this may be trauma such as child abuse and those kinds of things, and it could be other kinds of trauma. And again, referring back to the adverse childhood experiences study that we touched on several weeks ago, is some of the sources of this childhood trauma can be identified there. Male gender role socialization has in it a number of attitudes and beliefs that may very well contribute to the problem of battering. Now, the text says that the research results are vague, but this is again another thing that I think is sort of intuitive, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's accurate, but it is certainly intuitive, both in study and in working with persons. When you realize that, some of the traits that are socialized into males, the competition, the being on top, the aggressiveness, the sexuality, all those kinds of things that are a part of the traditional definition of masculinity, are also features that are found in maybe overemphasized among males who are engaged in intimate partner violence, and it is that sort of hyper masculinity that we've touched on earlier in this course that they're talking about here, but just attitudes and beliefs in and of themselves that kind of lend themselves to this notion of entitlement and control arise from gender role socialization in our society. Most of you are probably familiar with Sandra Bem's classification of gender statuses. When we talk about gender roles, there tends to be the common description of it, I guess, is a sort of a bipolar kind of description, that you're either very masculine or you're very feminine or you're something in between. And Bem's scale is actually has 4 dimensions, so that you have high feminine, high masculine, but you also have individuals with qualities that are strongly masculine and feminine, that is referred to as androgyny. And also individuals with low masculine and low feminine qualities that really, their attitudes and their behavioral patterns don't tend to connect to either gender so closely, and that's referred to as undifferentiated. And for whatever it's worth, the studies have demonstrated that in Bem's gender scales, that male batterers tend to score higher in the undifferentiated area. That is, that they don't have as much of a close association with either male or female gender characteristics. Pro-violence attitudes is certainly another thing in socialization of our children and young males that set up battering, and young females as well. And then again, entitlement, which goes back to this the traditional masculine socialization. Some would look at an individual's ability to solve problems, to communicate effectively, to understand cues from others and those types of things, or the lack of these skills, as a reason for battering. So that individuals that are, for instance, that are under assertive tend to be more verbal, more hostile on a verbal sense. They tend to overcompensate for their lack of assertiveness by being somewhat aggressive in their verbal approaches to others. Misperceptions of communications. Men have a tendency sometimes to underestimate the quality and number of caring gestures from their wives, and men who are engaged in intimate partner violence tend to see themselves as doing more and getting less out of the relationship, even though they may be missing a lot of cues from their wives. Men in general probably are not as good at picking up cues. Battering men are much worse. And then problem solving. There are theories that battering men really just are poor problem solvers, that they haven't been given those skills. That was touched on also in the socialization section, that in particularly in situations involving things like rejection or challenges from their partners or jealousy, which is a very powerful force in battering, oftentimes they don't know how to deal with this successfully. Now, another area, and I didn't even put alcohol and drug abuse as a cause here because I don't want it misunderstood here, but this is an area that is often misunderstood, that the role that alcohol and drug abuse play in violent relationships and in battering. And what we find is that oftentimes these alcohol and drug abuse co-occur with battering, but they're not the cause of the battering. Research has uniformly found associations between alcohol and substance abuse and interpersonal violence, but one cannot assume an inevitable causal link. Co-occurrence is not the same thing as causation. Some partner-violent men commit more serious and frequent violence when intoxicated, and this is something that is a factor that needs to be considered, that the use of substances lower inhibitions, and perhaps persons that are more prone to violence become more violent when under the influence of substances. But men who batter when drinking probably are going to batter when they're sober, and there are men who, and most men in fact, who drink even large quantities of alcohol never batter their female partners. So we can't determine that alcohol is predictive of interpersonal violence for males or females. It is certainly not a cause. Impulsivity that maybe comes from childhood abuse is a marker for both men and women with alcohol problems and with intimate partner violence. The impulsivity actually it kind of ties into both of those, and so that may have something to do with how alcohol and drug abuse play into this issue. And it's interesting also, marijuana abuse, and in an era where there's more and more emphasis upon legalization of marijuana. Marijuana abuse is associated with an increase in psychological abuse and yelling and insulting back and forth in relationships, and is indicated in the text that among minority populations it is a stronger predictor of intimate partner violence, more so than it is among Caucasians, and also more so among lower socioeconomic status than higher socioeconomic status. So other substances may have a part to play. Again, not a cause, but a contributor. What about emotional states as a cause? Negative life events oftentimes are associated with interpersonal violence or intimate partner violence. Things like unemployment, financial problems, also being of a younger age too. This is another thing. Other kinds of violent tendencies. Having been rejected or physically abused by one's own parents tend to contribute to this. As we've mentioned at other places, the gender role stress, high rates of masculine gender role stress are associated with a number of different things that lead to problems in interpersonal relationships, including physical health problems and psychological problems. And just a mood state such as anger and fear play a significant role in family violence, just as things come up and those kinds of things. So this is other explanations. Some people look to biology and genetics, and this is where a lot of times it digs up a lot of emotions about this, because some of these theories, particularly several of these theories, actually start looking at violence and battering as almost the results of the hardwiring of the male in the species. Evolutionary theories in fact hold that men are hardwired to be aggressive, that the aggressiveness in the males is the thing that has enabled the species to survive over the eons. And so even though aggression may be less necessary on a day-to-day basis than it once was, it is still a part of the male psyche, so to speak, they believe in a biological way. Another model which is similar to the evolutionary model is the biopsychosocial. You see the three different segments there: biology, psychology, and sociology. The biopsychosocial model holds that things like hormones and neurotransmitters in the brains might drive male violence in general, and so therefore contribute to male intimate partner violence. testosterone is blamed a lot of times. And high levels of testosterone in studies indicate that may contribute some predisposition to aggression. But generally speaking, for most men, even those with higher levels of testosterone in their system, that's moderated by your socialization, so that social expectations, so that men learn to control themselves. But there's been other studies actually that suggested instead of testosterone leading to violence, some studies have suggested that this other way around, that violent or aggressive circumstances result in an increase in testosterone. And so testosterone is often blamed for this, but it may actually be the outcome of violent behaviors. There are some indications that antisocial personality disorder symptoms might be inherited. Antisocial personalities are individual. When you look at that psychological diagnosis, that's the diagnosis that's associated with people who don't have any concern about the feelings of others. Those are the people that populate most of our prisons. That really what they want is more important than what others want. And there's some indication that could be inherited. Some look to brain structure to explain sometimes why men get angrier than women, and there are some sex differences, at least, that could explain this, and why men sometimes may have a harder time controlling aggression. But there's still a lot of research going on in this as well. And even brain disorders and brain structure may also contribute, as indicated here. This is an area that's perhaps even more controversial, and this is where you start looking at psychological diagnoses as reasons for battering. Personality disorders is the cause. And the text indicates inventories of psychopathology showed that a subsample of male batterers are diagnosable with some form of disorder. But the text also goes on to say that as many as 88% of batterers in one study suffered from some form of psychopathology. That doesn't necessarily mean personality disorders. It could be other diagnoses that aren't personality disorder. Now, again, the difference between a mental illness and a personality disorder, the big significant difference is that personality disorders can't change. Mental disorders can. They can be treated and maybe cured. But by definition, the way the psychologists look at personality disorders, at least, personality disorders are traits. They are qualities of an individual that don't change. And so while treatment might, for the motivated person with a personality disorder, and those are rare because this is a trait. It's not something that somebody feels uncomfortable with and wants to get rid of. So treatment might help the individual to learn to manage their tendencies better, so it doesn't impact their lives as much. But it's generally pretty unsuccessful. But there's a number of different personality disorders here that are indicated in the text that are associated with battering behaviors. Antisocial personality, as I mentioned earlier, is the one that oftentimes is the one you find most often diagnosed, I believe, with batterers. Other forms of mental illness probably exacerbate the conflicts, and we do know that mental disorders and relationship problems often occur together, so that you can see how that might contribute. But again, diagnoses of mental illnesses and personality disorders are not concrete things. These are things that are generally accepted in our field, but they're not they're not something you can touch. They're not something that you can see on an X-ray or a CAT scan like you can with cancers and growths and broken bones and things like this. And so these are really things that we agree exist, but may not really exist. It's just an explanation for a subset or behavior, or a subset of problems that we see. And so a lot of the critics look at that and say, we can't really put our finger in these things. And what it does when we rely upon personality disorders and mental illnesses to explain battering behaviors is that it creates an excuse for the perpetrator. It makes the perpetrator, gives the perpetrator an out, essentially, that says that, well, there's nothing I can do about this, or I couldn't help myself. And the critics, and we're talking largely about feminists here, but other other groups as well, really believe that the patriarchy and the special place it gives to males in a patriarchal structure is the thing that really underlies battering. And so their argument with looking into psychology and mental diagnoses, mental disorders and personality disorder diagnoses is that it really excuses the batterer and really distracts us from where we really need to be paying attention, and that is the messages that batterers get that give them the sense that they're entitled. And this is why, and we address this in another few weeks, that treatment of batterers generally is not about anger management. It's not about, certainly not about relationship counseling, and it is not about anger management. It's about batterers intervention, which is a much more intensive kind of treatment that looks at basic assumptions that batterers have about themselves and the world, about their gender roles, about the place that women have in wives in particular, and intimate partners have, and children have. You really have to batterers intervention really kind of gets at the root belief systems and works to change those things. And so mental health treatment really doesn't address those kinds of things. So. And there are those that believe that even reducing psychopathology through treatment with male perpetrators will not eliminate their violent partner abuse. Prior violence, another area. There are studies that show that some violent men are violent only towards their partners. Other studies, other men are only violent towards persons outside the family, and only 1 in 10 were violent with both groups. And so the selection of target, the groups really can be distinguished with their selection of targets, and there doesn't tend to be a lot of overlap between these. Batterers tend to be focused upon their families and not really violent outside the relationships, but when there is a batterer who has been involved in violence with other individuals outside the family, most people generally agree that these may be the most dangerous batterers around. These are the ones that probably, with those with prior criminal arrest records, and particularly those involving violence, may be the ones that we need to be the most cautious about in treating. And the text says personal characteristics of these offenders, these are the ones that have prior arrest records, such as pernicious drug use and impulsive rages to render them practically unfazed by arrest. And I'll close this section out with a couple slides, once again from Bancroft and Silverman. Their text, The Batterer as Parent, and we have here a few misconceptions about battering that I wanted to mention. And these are myths. The first myth is that it's the result of substance abuse. And as the slide indicates, and as we talked about earlier, substance abuse is not a cause, but it can contribute to its frequency and severity. Those who improve are usually in both batterers intervention and substance abuse treatment at the same time. One common response from a batterer, especially when the partner has left him, is to admit himself to a drug or alcohol program, saying, I'll get sober and I won't do that again. And again, that is not the cause of the battering, and so the batterer needs to go both through batterer's intervention and substance abuse treatment in those situations. Another myth is the result of mental illness. As we just talked about, batterers do not appear to have a substantially higher rate of mental illness, while there was a whole array of personality disorders in a few slides earlier. Bancroft and Silverman point out that there is no one personality disorder that is consistently connected to intimate partner violence. They do not believe the theories that it's connected to conflict resolution skills or anger management skills or communication skill deficits. And as we just got done saying, they stress that psychotherapy has little or no benefit in the short run and probably no benefit in the long run in these situations. The myth it's because of a problem with violence in general. Most batterers do not have problems related to violence outside of their domestic relationships, with a few exceptions, as we just talked about. And those who do have a problem with violence in general tend to be at increased risk to their partners and children. So it's nice to see some overlap and agreement between the different sources in this topic. And finally, the myth that it's more prevalent among certain racial, ethnic, or socioeconomic classes. And when you control for class, you find almost no difference between any racial or ethnic groups. And so the socioeconomic status seems to be more closely connected with battering problems than anything about culture and ethnicity. There is this kind of belief out there that there are cultures that condone marital violence, and that that is not the case. Now, there may be messages in different cultures that support domestic violence, and our culture being one of those. With our love of violence and in this pro-violence culture that we have, but really what we find is that economic factors are much more associated with battering problems than racial or ethnic issues. So with that, we'll conclude part 2 of this week's lecture. There is one more part. It'll be relatively short. We'll be looking at the role of females as batterers. And so close this out and take a break and come back and listen to the last section.